Well, thanks for inviting me, and it's always a pleasure to be here. Just in case you wonder, in Italy we're not just 1 hour ahead, we're 1 day and an hour ahead. But apart from that, my talk is divided in two parts. They're both related to pure word deafness. But the first thing, for those of you who, pure word deafness is a well-known phenomenon, which usually always follows brain damage. It's been used by Kussmaul for the first time in 1877, but he only used it to denote a dissociated impairment of auditory processing as contrasted with intact visual processing, regardless of associated output disorders. Now, since then, the term and other terms that have been used more or less as synonyms, like auditory agnosia, cortical deafness, and the like, refer most of all to the dissociation between impaired speech input processing and spared written language processing. However, auditory input processing can be damaged not just for speech, but also for any sort of environmental noise, from voices to sounds to music to just environmental noises. And these disorders can be associated to a different extent with output problems. Some patients with pure word deafness also have aphasia, others have agraphia, etc., etc. We've been lucky enough to see two cases. One, the first case I'll be talking about, has an extremely pure word deafness. This means that her auditory input processing disorder is restricted to language. She has no problems with music and environmental noises. She has no problems with comprehension of written language. She's not aphasic, she's not agraphic. The second case only has a mild, very mild conduction aphasia, but otherwise, on the input side, he is very similar to the first case. So for the next time, whenever I say pure word deafness, what I'm talking about is a disorder which is restricted to speech input processing. Now, the most frequent cause of pure word deafness is bilateral damage. Bilateral damage may affect cortex, both temporal cortices, as you see on the left, or it may affect bilaterally subcortical structures. In both cases, there is no functional input, no usable input to association cortices, and specifically to Wernicke's area. Now, of course, both lesions can be mostly cortical, both lesions can be entirely subcortical. One side may have mostly cortical lesion, the other an entirely subcortical lesion, but it's in general, I think that 2/3 of the cases suffer from bilateral lesions. Now, damage that results in pure word deafness or in disproportionate damage to speech input processing can be extremely huge. Really disastrous damage to both hemispheres. This is a case of cortical deafness, meaning that this subject did not react to auditory stimuli, even though his tone audiometry was entirely normal. But he behaved as though he was completely deaf. Damage can be less massive, not so small, or it can be reasonably small, as in a case we described several years ago. And this is a case of MELAS, mitochondrial encephalopathy, lactic acidosis, and stroke, where, as you can see, damage only affected the auditory cortices bilaterally. There are also cases where damage is subcortical, but as you can see here, damage is really, really big. In both cases, the cortex is spared, but essentially subcortical structures are devastated by brain damage. Less frequently, pure word deafness results from unilateral damage. Now, in these cases, it has been assumed that pure word deafness results from a disconnection mechanism. There should be just one strategic lesion that disrupts either the cortex, primary auditory cortices, and disrupts intracortical connections in the left hemisphere between primary auditory cortex and Wernicke's area, and at the same time disconnects intercortical, disrupts interhemispheric connections between right and left Wernicke's area, between Wernicke's area on the left and its right hemisphere homologue. So there is a strategic lesion that isolates Wernicke's area from auditory input. However, in most reported cases, damage is not strictly subcortical. So both Lichtheim and Kussmaul and then Geschwind and others basically took for granted that unilateral pure word deafness results from unilateral subcortical damage. Other people think that unilateral pure word deafness should not exist. Because the two temporal lobes basically do the same things when it comes to auditory processing, at least up to a certain level. However, possibly around 1/3 of the cases suffer from unilateral damage. But in these cases, as I said, damage affects both the cortex and subcortical structures. The extent of damage varies. Here you have a case by Slevich, which is huge. This is a case described by Rapp, the Walnuts, Purple and Rapp. And as you can see, cortical damage is quite extensive also in this case. And this is a case described by Stefanatos and co-workers where the lesion is very thin. I mean, it's a slice, basically. And this was the result of a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Now, clear cases with subcortical, the strictly subcortical damage, unilateral subcortical damage, are very difficult to come by. Two cases qualify with some question marks. This is a very famous historical case, Schuster and Taterka. And in this case, there is a huge hemorrhage that basically spared the cortex to some extent, of course, but this was clearly mostly a subcortical lesion. And this is a case by Takahashi and co-workers where basically the argument for damage being strictly subcortical is that PET scanning showed normal uptake in the temporal cortex. But really, strictly, uniquely subcortical lesions are very difficult to come by. There is another case described by Lippmann, but images are not available, that could qualify as a subcortical case. But these cases, as I said, are extremely rare. And yet it's been consistently assumed that unilateral pure word deafness results from a disconnection, that is, from the interruption of subcortical structures. Now, unfortunately, pure word deafness is a very rare disorder, and in many cases, especially in older cases, there is no neuroimaging documentation of lesions. So in many cases, when clinical history indicated unilateral lesions and the subject suffered from pure word deafness, the argument for an anatomical disconnection resulted from a functional index, namely performance on the so-called dichotic listening task. The dichotic listening task is based on the simultaneous presentation of an auditory input to both ears. The input is different, and you can use digits, syllables, non-words, words. So different types of stimuli have been used. But the simultaneity is what counts, and the subject is simply invited to report what he heard. In these conditions, there is a very consistent effect, the so-called right ear advantage. When you present two verbal stimuli to both ears simultaneously, the subject typically reports correctly more stimuli presented to the right ear than to the left ear. The account for this has been that auditory pathways are largely bilateral, but because the left hemisphere is dominant for speech, stimuli that are presented to the right ear get privileged access to language areas in the brain, and therefore are processed more efficiently, and they are reported correctly more often. And this is the so-called right ear advantage that's been reported very frequently, systematically, I would say, in all studies in normal subjects. However, patients with pure word deafness suffer from a disconnection of Wernicke's area on the left, and therefore stimuli that are presented to the right ear shouldn't reach the cortex, the auditory cortex on the left, and as a consequence, they should show a reversal of the right ear advantage. In other words, they should be more successful in reporting a stimuli presented to their left ear than to the right ear. This phenomenon has been called in many different ways: right ear extinction, or left ear advantage, or reverse right ear advantage, depending on which aspect of the odd behavior people wish to put the stress. But what is interesting is that it's been described in several cases of pure word deafness with unilateral temporal damage. And this, which is clearly a functional effect, has been considered as a signature of an anatomical disconnection. So it's been basically held that if subjects do not show a right ear advantage and actually show a left ear advantage, it's because there is a disconnection of Wernicke's area. Now, the first part of my talk basically paraphrases not to muddle the sacred and the profane, but I mean, it's pretty much equivalent to this. And it goes like this: do not let the right ear know what the left ear is hearing, which clearly tries to investigate the role of disconnection in unilateral pure word deafness. Can anatomical disconnection be the cause of functional disconnection that is observed in pure word deafness? The first case is patient FO, this is a case that has been studied in collaboration with Marco and Flavio and with other people in Rome, in addition to people in Trento, of course. The patient is a female. She's a right-hander. She's 38 years old. She owns an high school degree and has an administrative job. She was tested 3 years post-onset. This is her pure tone audiometry and brainstem auditory potential, and this clearly shows that, these are normal. There is no sign of cochlear or post-cochlear damage. There have been arguments that in some cases, at least, of pure word deafness, some kind of auditory, peripheral auditory deficit can influence the patient's behavior, but that's not, that's certainly not in this case. Vocal audiometry is substantially impaired, as you can see from these other indices. In terms of behavior, neuropsychological evaluation shows that there is a clear dissociation between tasks that require the patient to process auditory stimuli and equivalent tasks, equivalent in terms of difficulty, tasks that require processing of visual stimuli. So phoneme discrimination, minimal pairs, and auditory visual syllable discrimination are both severely impaired. But as you can see, okay, you cannot see it, but it's repetition and dictation, which both have a auditory input, are very poor, whereas reading aloud and delayed copy are unimpaired, and for both non-words and words. And lexical decision is severely impaired in the auditory modality and unimpaired in the visual modality, and word-picture matching, auditory comprehension is damaged, whereas visual comprehension is spared. Auditory comprehension is damaged because the subject is not able to distinguish between phonologically similar stimuli. So, for example, in Italian, pulire, to clean, is similar to punire, to publish. And when you present a picture of punire, she pairs it, when you present the word punire, she pairs it with pulire instead of the correct picture. So these are not meaning-related disorders, but these are clearly phonemically related errors. These are the results on auditory but non-verbal processing tasks, like sound-to-picture matching, naming musical instruments, naming famous melodies, evaluating whether two melodies are the same or different, recognizing voices of famous people, naming famous singers. Her performance is indistinguishable on Crawford and Howell's tasks from that of 20 normal subjects. I would not attach a particular meaning to this, but the patient has no interest whatsoever in music. So this performance is really, really normal. These are some representative errors in word repetition, writing to dictation, non-word repetition, non-word writing to dictation. Interestingly, the patient produces no phonemic errors, yes, in spontaneous speech.
So I was just wondering if you noticed any irritability or frequency
No.
effect?
Zero. We looked at word similarity with pseudo words, but that wasn't, there was no clear trend in that direction either. But certainly no central deficits of any type, no categorical, no part of speech, no frequency, no. There was of course a length effect. Longer words were reproduced incorrectly more frequently than short words, but other than that. No. Oddly enough, we really tried to find something wrong with her speech, but even mean length of utterance in this subject was comparable to that of normals, with subordinate clauses, with relatives. Really language was intact. Now we ran this patient completed a dichotic listening task, and these are the results. Essentially, this is not a reversal of the right ear advantage, this is a right ear suppression. Basically, the patient cannot report correctly, essentially, any stimuli presented to her left ear. Interestingly, in terms of behavior, the only significant change that occurred after her stroke is that at work, she used to answer the phone and put the phone to her right ear. Now she has to use her left ear because she says that if she puts it to the right ear, she doesn't really understand what people talk about. And she has particular problems with last names and with numbers. Of course, in everyday life, you don't use pseudo words. So that's not an issue with her. So to summarize behavioral data, her disorder is limited to speech input processing with intact processing of other sources of auditory input, with intact processing of written language, both on the input side and on the production side, with essentially intact speech output and a massive reversal of the right ear advantage. So this subject has the hallmark, the functional hallmark of a disconnection. Now the question is an anatomical disconnection the cause of pure word deafness in this particular case? Okay, this is Marco's gift for my birthday, which will be in October, but he sent it as a gift, in advance. And as you can see, damage is very, very circumscribed. It affects the superior temporal gyrus. It affects the part, maybe, of the... certainly the superior temporal gyrus is largely affected, part of the angular gyrus, part of the posterior and inferior portion of the insula. But damage is never complete. So, there is sparing of the posterior and superior portion of Herschel's gyrus. The superior temporal gyrus is not totally disrupted. There is a little extension to the angular gyrus, but that's also partly spared. Yes?
What was the pathology?
Stroke.
Oh,
She had a stroke.
ischemic.
Yeah, ischemic stroke, yes. So in this subject, we measured cortical thickness and gyral volume, and we reconstructed white matter pathways via tractography and spherical deconvolution and HMOA. In terms of cortical thickness and gyral volume, many areas have thickness and volume below normal values. The picture at the bottom right shows the results of the comparison between thickness in this subject and thickness in the same areas in 35 or 40 controls. I don't remember exactly. A couple of things are interesting. There is extensive damage. This is 3 years post-onset. There is extensive damage along the supratemporal gyrus, but damage is sort of uneven, and there is a spared area at least along the superior temporal gyrus. And what is also interesting is that thinning of the cortex seems to be widespread and to involve large networks, large-scale networks, and not be just limited to the superior temporal gyrus, even with such a small structural lesion. This is the other part of Marco's gift. Now, as you can see, damage is, left is there, and it's here. And as you can see, the lesion would be here. There is reduction of the in the superior temporal longitudinal fasciculus running into the superior temporal gyrus and next to Eschel's gyrus. There is a reduction of transcallosal temporal fibers, whereas, for example, the optic pathways, the visual radiations are intact. And there is also reduction of thalamotemporal connections in yellow. As for individual tracts, the temporal longitudinal fasciculus is partly but clearly damaged. The transcallosal pathways are clearly reduced on the left and rather than on the right. And thalamic temporal radiations that include the acoustic radiations are clearly reduced in volume on the left as compared to the right, whereas optic radiations are entirely symmetrical. So there's no damage beyond the auditory pathways. So basically, there is a small left temporal lesion with partial damage to Eschel's gyrus, to thalamotemporal pathways, to transcallosal projections. There is reduced cortical thickness and gyral volume in STG and in the posterior insula. And there is a reduced cortical thickness in a large-scale network in the left hemisphere, including areas that are far away from the primary vascular lesion. What does this case tell us? First of all, that functional disconnection does not require anatomical disconnection. There is damage to each component, to each bit of the temporal path of the auditory pathways in this subject, but never complete. So, part of Eschel's gyrus is spared, part of the thalamic radiations are spared, part of the superior of the temporal longitudinal fasciculus is spared, part of the transcallosal temporal fibers are spared, and yet this subject does not perceive stimuli that are delivered to her right ear. So there is a functional disconnection in the absence of a complete anatomical disconnection. It could be because, for example, stimuli get to the left hemisphere completely out of sync, and therefore they cannot be, in a way, analyzed appropriately. Or it could be because the two ears convey stimuli in a funny combinations. I don't think we have any reasonable functional account for this, but it's obvious that a complete inability to process stimuli getting to the right ear does not require a complete interruption of a complete disconnection of left hemisphere areas in Wernicke's area. So in this case, word deafness seems to be caused by a mixture of cortical and subcortical damage. Now, regardless of whether cortical damage is more critical than subcortical damage or whether both are critical, one clear fact is that the left and the right hemisphere do not do the same things when it comes to analyzing auditory input. Because if that were the case, auditory input should be processed efficiently by the right hemisphere. The fact that a lesion, that damage, which is only affecting processing in the left hemisphere, results in word deafness, invites the conclusion that the two temporal cortices, the auditory temporal cortices, do not do the same work. Current theories actually only assume a quantitative, not a qualitative difference between the two temporal cortices, the two auditory temporal cortices, and therefore this is somewhat at odds with that kind of account. Another clear conclusion is that the circumscribed vascular lesion results in damage to a large-scale neural network. This is not entirely expected, but unquestionable. And the other interesting conclusion is sparing of spontaneous speech constitutes a problem for the HSFC, that is the hierarchical state feedback control. This is a hypothesis put forward by Greg Hickok recently, which basically assumes that auditory representations are involved very early in speech. When we talk, while we talk, or even before we talk, we already activate auditory representations of the words we are going to say. Therefore, if you have damage to these auditory representations, you should have aphasia. You should be unable to talk. And this is basically stated on account of the existence of patients with so-called conduction aphasia who have phonemic discrimination difficulties and who make phonemic errors in speech. The fact that this subject clearly has difficulty in processing auditory speech, but no difficulty whatsoever in speech, argues against the idea that auditory representations are activated so early in speech. Maybe they can be used to monitor speech, if anything, but certainly they're not activated before speech is produced. And that's the end of the first part of my presentation. The second part is called See What I'm Saying. It refers to the audio mechanisms involved in audiovisual integration in unilateral pure word deafness. In many reports of patients of this type, there is a clear statement. The patient's behavior improved if he was allowed to read the lips of the examiner. It's been reported in Wolfart et al., Michel et al., Shindo et al., etc., etc., etc. It is a quite stable phenomenon. These patients are deaf if one basically masks, the examiner's mouth is masked, but then it's not that they become normal, but their performance improves if they're allowed to read lips. Now, reading lips is not necessarily an advantage for those whose lips are read, and even recently, it's been restated, but there is a phenomenon that is being used to document audiovisual integration. The so-called Mcgurk Effect is a phenomenon that is based on an interesting combination of contrasting stimuli. If you see someone saying ga ga, that is someone whose mouth is positioned in the position you used to say ga, and at the same time you hear ba, a sound ba, basically you perceive da. So you have, it's also called the Mcgurk illusion. So the hearing pa overlaid into a visual ka, or hearing ka overlaid onto a visual pa, may result in you hearing ta. If you do ba, ga, you hear da. If you do pa, ka, you hear ta. It's a very strong illusion, and it's observed in normals. And it shows that we don't actually only hear through our ears, but we also hear through our eyes. Now, this phenomenon has been studied in the past few years. This is one example. These are patients who underwent awake surgery for epilepsy. In these subjects, the focus was very distant from the place where the electrodes were recording the responses. The stimuli consisted of tone pips and or red circles shown on black background, either alone or in combination. And in some cases, Monholm co-workers looked at sites where the auditory stimulus alone and the visual stimulus alone both resulted in clear responses, and then presented audio and visual. And the results were like this. In other words, when there was both an auditory and a visual stimulus, the response was increased, different and increased, as opposed to when auditory and visual stimuli were presented separately and independently. Now, this effect has been studied in normal subjects in an fMRI study that basically focuses on the STG, on the posterior portion of STG, as a possible site where audio-visual integration takes place. But it's a debated result because there are patients, for example, this subject, SJ, had extensive damage to the superior temporal sulcus and yet maintained a clear Mcgurk effect. So basically the idea is that the site of the Mcgurk effect is the superior temporal gyrus, but the proposal is being challenged. Now, one possible mechanism one possible brain structure that's been involved in audiovisual integration has been the middle longitudinal fasciculus. The middle longitudinal fasciculus has two branches, one that connects the superior temporal gyrus to the angular gyrus, and one that connects the superior temporal gyrus to the superior parietal lobule. And especially the component that goes to the superior parietal lobule has been considered as a possible site, as a critical mechanism for audiovisual integration. Macris in 2013 had a multi-tensor study where he differentiated the two components of the middle longitudinal fasciculus and basically proposed that the components that connect the superior temporal gyrus and the superior parietal lobe are critical for audiovisual integration. Now, if audiovisual integration happens in the superior temporal gyrus, and if the middle longitudinal fasciculus is a critical structure for this specific phenomenon, then the middle longitudinal fasciculus should be intact in patients with pure word deafness who show normal audiovisual integration. Now, here comes the other subject. This is a 47-year-old male. He's an MD, he's a right-hander. He took his MD in Italy, moved to Paris, then moved to Africa for a study, then he lived there for 15 years, went back to Paris for vacation, had a stroke, went back to Italy, had speech therapy in Italy, now went back to Paris, and now he's back to Africa. I mean, this to say that this is just been traveling around for a long time. But he was tested only 2 months post-onset. Different to the other subject, he has some mild peripheral hearing loss on pure tone audiometry, but his auditory evoked responses are completely normal and rule out damage up to the cochlea. His results are just like the other case, but more severe. In addition, he's also aphasic. He has a conduction aphasia. What is interesting is that these two tasks were conducted both without letting the subject to read lips and letting him read lips. And as you can see, in one case, phonemic discrimination was simply not feasible, whereas, I mean, it was clearly damaged, but feasible when he could see lips. And in auditory visual matching, the number of errors sort of dropped. And he clearly stated that if he could see lips, he was doing better. As you can see, also in this case, non-word and word transcoding tasks are poor if the task requires processing auditory input, whereas reading aloud and delayed copy, reading aloud is impaired, but that's because he has a conduction aphasia. But for example, delayed copy is normal, visual lexical decision is normal, visual comprehension of words is normal, whereas auditory lexical decision and auditory comprehension are clearly impaired. He also was administered a dichotic listening task, and like the other subject, he showed an inversion of the right ear advantage. His lesion is somewhat larger. As you can see, the superior temporal sulcus is much larger than normal, and his damage is certainly more extensive than in the other case. But also in this case, the posterior portion of Eschel's gyrus, that it's not clearly seen here, is not completely damaged. I mean, there seem to be some minor sparing. This case is just being studied now, so I don't have very clear data to show. But this is the tractography of the arcuate. This is the tractography of the middle longitudinal fasciculus, and as you can see, there is a clear difference between left and right, whereas the IFOF, the inferior front-occipital fasciculus, is absolutely unimpaired. This is the spherical deconvolution of the arcuate. There are differences, but not substantial. There is a substantially spared IFOF, and there is a spared inferior longitudinal fasciculus. Now, what happened in the Mcgurk? In the Mcgurk, we have two types of stimuli. Stimuli where the mouth and the sound are congruent, that is, the mouth says pa, and the auditory stimulus is pa. There are stimuli that are contrasting, that are non-congruent, so you see pa but you hear da, or vice versa. And there are stimuli that are different and may result in a Mcgurk effect. There is stimuli where the stimulus is ba and you hear, and what you see is ba and what you hear is ga, and stimuli in which what you see is ga and what you hear is ba. The subjects have 20 controls, and these subjects were given the same tasks, and they only had to say what they heard. They were told that they would hear ba, da, or ga, and they were asked to say whatever they heard. These are the results. I mean, whenever stimuli, visual stimuli and auditory stimuli were congruent, none of the patients and none of the controls made errors. So pa, seen and heard, no error whatsoever. These are pairs that are incongruent but cannot result into a Mcgurk effect. So ba, da, ga, da, ba. Okay, is it clear? And subjects had to say, what did you hear? Controls essentially always rely on the auditory stimulus. So they reported whatever they heard. They essentially always ignored what they saw. With patients, it was quite different. So for example, patient FO reported much more often what she saw than what she heard. And the same was true also for GAB, who reported visual stimuli much more often than controls. This is not particularly strange, this is not surprising. These subjects are word deaf, so basically auditory input is degraded, disrupted. I mean, there's something wrong with their auditory input. Therefore, it's only fair that they should rely more on what they see as opposed to what they hear. And this is shown here. This is the ratio of responses to auditory versus visual stimuli in the 20 controls and in the two subjects. As you can see, that they're totally different behaviors. But what about Mcgurk tasks? Because to argue for audiovisual integration, you have to show that the Mcgurk effect exists, that when a subject sees ba and hears ga, he says that he's just heard da. And these are the results. These are the controls. They show Mcgurk effects occasionally, but the two subjects show the Mcgurk effect much more frequently than controls. So paradoxically, audiovisual integration is much more frequent and systematic in patients than it is in word deaf patients than in controls. Now, in these subjects then, the expectation is they're word deaf, they have a Mcgurk effect. If the middle longitudinal fasciculus is critical for the Mcgurk to ensure audiovisual integration, their middle longitudinal fasciculus should be intact. I mean, there should be no damage to the middle longitudinal fasciculus. Now, these two subjects have not been completely studied in full so far, but there is some evidence that the middle longitudinal fasciculus is not intact in the first subject, and it's even more damaged in the other subject. These are the same structures overlaid on the T1 of each subject. And as you can see, especially in this subject, there is a real impoverishment of the middle longitudinal fasciculus. In these subjects, both fractional anisotropy and apparent fiber density were calculated. Fractional anisotropy is comparable to that observed in normals, but apparent fiber density is substantially different, both in FO and in GB, that is the two patients with word deafness, as opposed to 10 or 9 healthy individuals. So, to conclude this second part, both patients suffered unilateral temporal damage and have a very selective form of word deafness. They both benefit from lip reading. Now, in healthy controls, in a Mcgurk-like experiment, there is an extensive reliance on auditory information and occasional occurrences of the Mcgurk illusion. Whereas in pure word deafness patients, there is an extensive reliance on visual information, much more than in controls, but there is an increased Mcgurk effect, that is an increased audiovisual integration in the presence of abnormal diffusion metrics for the middle longitudinal fasciculus. Therefore, what these cases tell us is that audiovisual integration does exist, but that the middle longitudinal fasciculus is an unlikely neural underpinning for audiovisual integration. And that's it. Thank you.